What if the greatest challenge to the world's superpower isn't military might, isn't some sudden war, but is instead a decades-long system built entirely on self-sufficiency and meticulous long-term planning?
That is precisely the premise in the material we're diving into today.
Yeah,
I mean, for decades, we've sort of operated under this assumption that global dominance means controlling the world's financial plumbing and, having the biggest navy.
right.
But these sources, they argue that the whole architecture is cracking, and not due to collapse or direct conflict, but because a major nation has essentially mastered technological and strategic independence.
That's it. So our mission today is a deep dive into the specific arguments from these materials, really focusing on how China is challenging the United States' long-held global dominance. It's a very compelling and very detailed look at that strategy.
And the analysis breaks it down into 5 crucial areas. You have tech self-sufficiency, economic independence from the dollar, military deterrence, long-term strategic planning, and finally, a whole new way of looking at global influence.
And the assertion that really ties it all together is that this isn't about just, catching up to the U.S. It's about building a completely resilient system
Mhm.
that, well, that fundamentally does not rely on the American-built global architecture.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. And let's start with what the authors see as the foundation for everything else, the tech rivalry.
What's really fascinating here is the core claim that China has built what they call a full-stack tech ecosystem.
A full stack.
Yeah, and this isn't just about making cheap copies. It's about designing entire systems from the operating system all the way up to the app layer that are inherently resilient to U.S. sanctions and competition.
And when you look at the sheer scale of the alternatives they detail in the source material, I mean, it paints a picture of deliberate parallel construction. They have platforms that, as the authors say, compete with or even outperform their U.S. counterparts, at least in their own market.
Exactly. So for search and for AI, you have Baidu, not Google. In the smartphone space, it's not just Apple. It's Xiaomi, Huawei, Honor, all aggressively competing.
And for e-commerce, it's not Amazon, it's Alibaba and JD.com.
Right. But the one that the sources say is a truly eye-opening difference is social media. Here in the West, we have Meta's, fragmented suite, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp,
All separate things.
all separate. China built WeChat. And the material calls it an all-in-one super app. And that concept is really key to understanding the structural difference.
So it's not just for messaging.
Oh, not at all. It integrates government services, paying your utility bills, mobile finance, your entire social life, all into one essential system you use every single day. The authors argue that this makes the Western social media ecosystem feel, well, almost like a relic by comparison.
And this self-reliance, it goes all the way down to the foundational software, right? They're pushing their own Linux-based systems and Huawei's Harmony OS as real alternatives to, say, Windows and Android.
The whole point is resilience, and the ultimate stress test for this, the big surprise the source material highlights, was Huawei. When the U.S. hit them with sanctions, cutting them off from critical chips and software,
The consensus was that they were finished.
crippled, that was the word everyone used. But their response was a stunning demonstration of this technological independence. Huawei shocked everyone by producing its own 7-nanometer AI chip, the Ascend 910B.
And then they put it in a phone.
And then they released the Mate 60 Pro smartphone. Now, that 7-nanometer scale is so important because it was thought to be impossible without Western tech. This phone was designed specifically to require no U.S. components. None. That wasn't just survival, it was independence.
That's staggering, especially when the source draws a contrast with other rising nations. They use India as an example. It's seen as this rising democratic power, but the material argues India is still heavily reliant on U.S. platforms.
Very reliant. Google, Facebook, U.S. venture capital, U.S.-hosted infrastructure. I mean, the sources even point out that India's huge Aadhaar digital ID system, it runs on Amazon Web Services.
So that's framed as a critical vulnerability, a dependence that China, by building its full stack, has systematically eliminated.
Exactly. China's tech is built to resist. Others are still built to rely.
So if they've managed to insulate their technology, the next logical step is financial independence. That brings us to our second area, economic architecture. How does the source claim they're reducing their reliance on the whole U.S.-built system, the dollar, SWIFT, the IMF?
Well, it all flows from their sheer trade volume. That's what underpins the whole effort. The authors note China is the world's largest trading nation, the biggest exporter, and it's the largest trading partner for over 130 countries.
Even Europe trades more with China than the U.S.
That's right. And the mechanism for turning that trade power into real lasting influence is the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. It's this massive global infrastructure truck roads, ports, pipelines, with over 150 countries signing on.
And the sources claim the reason it's so successful compared to Western aid is interesting.
It's fascinating. They claim that many nations are just tired of being lectured by Washington about democracy or internal governance. China, by contrast, shows up with a business proposition. It's cranes and contracts, not political conditions.
The material also looks at the Trump trade war. The initial thinking in the West was that tariffs would cripple Beijing.
But the authors argue the opposite happened. The trade war actually forced them to accelerate their self-reliance. It pushed them to secure their own supply chains and diversify imports away from the U.S., turning to places like Brazil and Russia instead.
Which then brings up the obvious question for Beijing. Why rely on a financial system that can be used as a weapon against you?
Exactly. And that's what's driving this huge effort to bypass the U.S. system. Promoting the yuan for trade, developing their own central bank digital currency, the ECNY, and launching financial platforms that operate completely outside of the SWIFT system.
The sources are pretty clear. They call it an active effort to slowly de-dollarize the world. The idea being that if the U.S. uses the dollar as a weapon, other nations will find a way to disarm.
And China is building the infrastructure for that disarmament. That's the key insight. The U.S. control over the global economy depends on other nations choosing to participate. As more viable alternatives emerge, that control, well, it naturally begins to slip.
Okay, let's shift to the third core area. Military deterrence, the ultimate insurance policy for any major power. The claim here is that China has quietly built the world's second most powerful military, but with a different strategy.
Right, it's not about global projection. It's about modern deterrence that makes U.S. intervention in Asia just extremely costly. The data they cite is remarkable. China now has the world's largest navy by number of vessels.
By number of ships, not total weight.
Not by tonnage, correct.
Oh.
But more strategically significant are specific weapons like the DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile, the carrier killer.
That name says it all, but why is it a game changer?
Because it fundamentally changes the risk calculation for the U.S. Navy. It's designed specifically to deter U.S. aircraft carriers from operating anywhere near the Western Pacific. It forces those carriers to stay hundreds of miles further out, which reduces their immediate power. It's a very effective area denial strategy.
So the goal isn't to match the U.S. base for base around the world. It's about making the cost of entry into its neighborhood catastrophically high.
Exactly. And you see that in the spending. The U.S. spends over $800 billion a year, a lot of it on maintaining 750 foreign bases. China, on the other hand, focuses its resources at home on R&D, cyber, space tech, AI-driven defense. The sources call it strategic discipline.
And the result, according to the material, is that military intervention in their backyard, especially around a place like Taiwan, is now virtually impossible without devastating consequences. It's a regional defense strategy on a scale we haven't seen before.
Which then raises a provocative question about the whole aggression narrative. The source points out the irony. China has one foreign base in Djibouti. The U.S. has hundreds.
Right.
So the authors ask, are U.S. warships near China's coast freedom of navigation, as Washington says, or are they a provocation that justifies China's intense militarization of its own defense perimeter?
It's definitely a different way of looking at who is pushing against whose borders. But none of this happens overnight. It requires consistent policy, which leads right into our fourth segment, long-term vision versus short-term chaos.
And the core claim here is that China's political stability and its decades-long planning consistently outperform the short-term policy reversals and political chaos that the sources say you see in Western democracies.
And the most tangible proof they cite is infrastructure. Just look at high-speed rail. China has over 45,000 kilometers of it. That's more than the rest of the world combined.
And it's not just rail. It's 5G networks, smart cities, cashless ecosystems, all deployed incredibly rapidly. You compare that to the source's description of, delayed Amtrak projects or the slow adoption of digital payments in the U.S.
The system prioritizes execution.
Over endless debate, yes. And that long-term vision has also completely shifted global markets, especially in green tech. Think about electric vehicles.
While the West was still debating climate policy.
China was executing. They went from debate to dominance. They're now the undisputed global leader in EVs. Companies like BYD and IO, XPeng, they're outselling legacy Western automakers. BYD just overtook Tesla in global sales.
A huge symbolic shift.
Massive. But it's not just the sales figures. The source stresses that China controls the entire EV supply chain, from processing rare earth minerals to battery production. That's the outcome of long-term, consistent industrial policy.
And it's all driven by this ultimate goal they have, right? Their focus on the year 2049, the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic. That centralized vision, the sources argue, it generates a high level of trust among citizens because they see tangible world-class results.
Exactly.
Which brings us to our final segment. If you have your own tech, your own economy, and this incredible infrastructure, how do you translate that into global influence without using military force?
The core argument is that China is doing it by building partnerships, trade, and infrastructure. They're offering a development model that many nations, frankly, prefer over what they see as the American model.
And the source draws a really sharp contrast between the two. The U.S. approach is described as might makes right, military bases, political conditions, those lectures about democracy we mentioned.
Right. And the China model is much simpler. It's cranes, engineers, and investment. It's cables and contracts, things designed to produce immediate, visible results.
You see this clearly in the regional examples, like Africa.
Absolutely. The source credits China with helping build thousands of kilometers of railways and roads, establishing universities. It's about development and partnership, not charity or conditional aid.
And this extends everywhere. Sri Lanka, Kenya, the Middle East, Latin America. They're getting new ports, tech zones, 5G rollouts, all without the political strings attached that often come with funding from Washington. It's just a different way to win influence.
And what's really compelling is the source's emphasis on historical restraint. China hasn't fought a major war in over 4 decades. A duration of restraint they claim is unmatched by any other great power today.
So it's proof that influence can be won through commerce and building, not conquest.
That's the argument. Which brings us back to the primary overarching point of the entire source material. The real challenge to the U.S. isn't military parity. It's China's success in building its own resilient parallel systems and offering that non-conditional development model to the world.
If we connect that to the bigger picture, the material argues that once a nation achieves that full independence, technological, economic, strategic, the old levers of superpower control just stop working as well.
Sanctions, financial blockades, distant military threats, they become increasingly ineffective. The sources suggest the U.S. fears this truth because the rising nation is competing by building instead of bombing.
Which raises an important question for you to consider. If this analysis is correct, if the era of technological and financial dependence is really ending, does that mean the competition for global influence will be won by whoever builds the most compelling internal system, rather than who fields the largest military?
It's a fascinating thought. It would require us to reevaluate the very definition of a superpower in the 21st century. And that is definitely something to mull over as you see future news about these global shifts.
That wraps up this deep dive into the source material. We hope this has given you a clearer, more nuanced understanding of the core arguments shaping this geopolitical discussion.